you guys hear me? Is it coming from the...
Closer.
Hello?
A little bit closer?
Is it possible to tilt it down?
Yeah,
I think so.
You can like hold it.
We can like take it
Yeah.
over.
Oh, you can also hold it. That
Hello?
too.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's better, I think.
Yeah.
Yep.
Aria, just let me know when
You're good.
Oh, it's starting?
Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Well, hello, I'm Yasmin, and I'll be talking about collisions and character movement, specifically in VR, but hopefully the collisions are applicable to y'all too. So, hi, I do a bit of 3D art. I've made a few games in college, and today I'll be talking about a virtual reality game I made as my senior project. In it, I mostly was working on movement, implementation, and engine, and basically like putting all the assets in there and making it visually nice. So, today I'll be talking about some of the movement considerations when it comes to VR. So, the two main kinds are stationary VR, where you can only rotate your head to look around, so you can only look up, down, side to side, and mobile VR, where you can actually move in 3D space. So that means you can actually crouch down a bit, you can tilt back and forth, or you can even walk. The main locomotion methods are room scale VR, where you can actually walk around in a room inside of a designated play space. Motion based, which you make gestures and stuff, like maybe moving your arms up and down to climb something. Controllers, like thumbsticks, joysticks and stuff to move around. And then teleportation, where you can kind of point somewhere and click a trigger usually, and then it will just pop you in. And you can also have none of these, a different method, or multiple combined. So, the downside, oftentimes in VR, is that you've got to keep in mind that people will get nauseous. So things like lower frame rate will cause visual lag, and then whenever you move your head, it just gets really disorienting. Same thing with bumpiness. If something is moving your head up and down in the headset, in-game, it can kind of jostle the person. Controller movements can sometimes make people nauseous too, which is why a lot of VR games will place characters inside of a vehicle, because it kind of grounds them and ties them back to reality. A lot of people also have fears of heights and stuff, so that's something you often do. So what did I do for my game? We went with room scale VR plus controller movement. It's not the most accessible, but we felt it was worth it for the escape room kind of vibe we were going for. We used snap rotation, and we also had full scale room movement within a play space. So that meant that not only could people use controllers to walk around, they could also physically move around in real space to interact and look around it. So the quirks began right away. So when you make a play space, you can kind of make it whatever shape you want. So when I was testing in a classroom, and there were a bunch of chairs and tables, so I ended up making a very strange L shape. When I started loading up the game, in one corner of the L, I'd sometimes notice I'd spawn into a different room, or I'd fall through the map. So what was going on? It turns out the center of the play space is what the game engine considers the player start location. So the player location is just applied as an offset. And I noticed a lot of other big budget games also make the same mistake. So if anyone is ever making a VR game, keep this in mind. Make sure you teleport based off of like the player location right at the very start of the game, just to like get the player in the right spot. All right, you might have noticed you're kind of an unstoppable force in VR, and the developers have to nerf you a bit. That was just one example. So let's talk about how we can kind of rein that back in. When you have a player character, it's quite similar to a traditional game, but there's like a few extra elements. So we have a collision capsule underneath the headset, and I also added an overlap sphere and overlap spheres on the hands, and we'll kind of go into that later. But you also have a separate hand mesh that is not directly always falling behind your hand in VR. Like, you've got your hand, and then you've got the hand mesh, and well, what happens if there's a wall in front of you in the game? In real life, you could just reach through the wall, right? What's going to happen to your hand mesh? You don't want to be able to grab the item right behind it. So that's why we have separate collisions kind of following behind the hand. So if you pass your hand through an object, it will kind of be stopped in the game. And that's a similar reason for having the player capsule, like right underneath the player's head. So we make sure to constantly be teleporting it underneath the location of the player so that they can't walk through walls. And so that they can also crouch down and go under walls. So we'll make sure that the height is like an offset based off of how tall they are. Now, now we start banging our head against the walls, both literally and figuratively, because what if a player wants to look over a table or a chair, pretend they're sitting down in it? Well, if the capsule is always under your head, you can't. The table will be basically like a collision in front of you. So the solution is to allow the player to move without the capsule constantly teleporting underneath them. Now, how does that work? Well, that's where the spheres come in. So that sphere against the head, will be using that as the main thing. Basically like a marker. Whenever that starts overlapping with something, we'll say, hey, bring that capsule back to us. And that will prevent you from walking through obstacles. So the main ways we used it were every time your head overlaps with something, and then anytime you're using the thumbstick motion. Because anytime you want to be moving somewhere, you want to be sure that the ground level is where you're supposed to be. Makes sense. Some other games implement other solutions, but we felt our one was the most suited to what we were trying to do. So some games will make it so that you fade to black and disable input whenever you move your head into a wall, but I felt like that was kind of distracting. And it feels a little weird because I tested it out. You can like walk several steps forward, and then the moment you take one step back, it's like you're back wherever you were beforehand. I don't know. It's a solution. Then you can just stop players from looking over objects, or you can make collisions specifically for the player. You know, but the problem with collisions specific for the player is if you start throwing objects in the game at those weird collisions, you'll start to break the illusion. You'll see that those collisions are very janky. So let's categorize collisions to make it a little less janky and a little less visible to see what we're doing behind the scenes. So first of all, just in case people don't know about collisions and collision shapes and stuff, I'll go over the basics. Physics in general is a very performance-hungry part of a game. So the more simple you can make your collisions, the easier it will be to calculate. Prisms and capsules are some of the very base forms. You can make custom collisions with your own meshes. You can combine multiple simple shapes together to create a collision. And then you can also have complex collisions where it's like based off of the individual vertices of the mesh. So for our game, we used a lot of multiple simple shapes, and then when we could, we used completely simple shapes. But the fun part is when you get into collision channels, and hopefully this part can be relevant to you all too. So you can actually create categories to differentiate an object's collisions from each other, and create preset reactions to these collisions. So you can have specific items choose to collide with specific objects, overlap with them, ignore them. Now I'll kind of explain what it means. So in this example here, the ground is collide all. The player would be colliding with the ground. If they stuck their head into the ground, it would be colliding with the ground. And if they threw an object at the ground, it would collide with the ground. However, what if you wanted stairs, and you didn't want to make the player's head bump up and down every single time they walked up a step? Well, then you can make a player ramp for them. So you want those collisions to only affect the player capsule, but you don't really want those collisions to affect an object when you throw it at the stairs, because you don't want to see that ramp. So, and ignore all. You can also use that for objects that maybe you put in the scene just for visuals, and it's not really playing a part in the game. So if you have light beams, things like that, nothing should be taking those into account. Just leave them out. Make it easier for the engine. So I'm going to break down just this one shot and kind of go through some of the ways that we handle collisions in just this scene. So at the very top, there's a lot of objects there that you're not going to be able to throw at, and you're never going to reach, so they just don't have any collisions. No one's never going to notice. The stairs, they have a special ramp on them so that the player can walk up them smoothly, but when you throw objects at the stairs, they'll bounce on each step. The tables allow you to look over them, but not walk through them if you're using the controller. The railings on the second level are actually, they actually have a second hidden wall, so that the player, even if they put their head over it and started moving, they wouldn't start moving past the railings and fall down. And then for objects that the player wants to grab and interact with their hands, they secretly have a really, really big collision, so that it's very easy for them to grab, but at the same time that collision is not visible to many other objects. So that's just kind of an overview of the methodology. I hope that was helpful. I know it's kind of niche. You can play the game on side quest if you want. Ironically, I think the collisions might be broken in that build. All right, that's all for me. If anyone has any questions, maybe someone can pass around the mic and ask them. I'm not sure it's connected.
Are you hear me?
Yep.
As someone who doesn't really use much VR, I'm kind of more from like a curiosity perspective. You talked about ducking underneath objects. As a not very tall person myself who sees people who are much taller from a gameplay perspective, is ducking under stuff that common in VR? I imagine you have to kind of game balance around, is it kind of like an odd job situation where people who are short have an innate advantage? Or you kind of just take an average and you kind of hope for all 5'8"s.
There are a few methods to that. One of them is that you actually scale the player height based off of where they're starting with at the beginning, and you can kind of configure it. So a person will be like, configure my height, and they'll stand up tall and kind of click a button and it'll be like, okay, now we'll scale you to where we expect you. Because I've noticed like sometimes if you put a little kid in VR, they can't reach all the tables and they just can't play the games because there's stuff on them and they can't reach it and they can't see it. So yeah, actually height can actually make a big difference in games. So we didn't actually have that much that relied on ducking. We just ended up implementing it because we weren't sure what kind of game we were going to make at the start. And it ended up not being relevant, but it's in there.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, just curious. So I guess kids would be in the other situation where suddenly they'd be able to reach everything on the table, but then in real life they'd go back to being kind of
Yeah, so if you want in VR, you can basically be whatever height you want if the game allows you to have that set. So it's almost like a height slider. So how it's implemented varies, but it can be very fun, honestly, to be like, oh, so this is what it feels like to be tall. Or vice versa,
Thanks.
Hey, so in other VR games I've played in the past, a common issue I've had, and I wonder if you have a solution for this, is occasionally there'll be objects that are lower down than the floor you're standing on, like if they're on a hill, and you physically can't grab them because the floor is flat, like in a normal house. I was wondering if this is a solution that you have a cool solution for, or if it's more of like a mapping issue.
Well, we kind of had a magic-ish game, and we didn't do it for this one, but we were talking about how cool it would be to have a bit of a force grab for a bit of a radius around you. So we didn't have any items that were really essential in our game, so that didn't come up, but for our main items, we made sure there was like a teleport feature, so you can kind of summon them back. But yes, that's definitely, that can be an issue. It's also sometimes frustrating to have to crouch down to pick things up. But yeah, you're right. In games with slopes, there are often things below the physical floor in the real world, and you just cannot even reach it. So definitely a big problem. Our game didn't really have slopes like that, so we didn't have to solve it, but I would love to try and make a game that does take that into consideration one day.
Thank you.
What kind of solutions did you opt for as far as like notifying the player of what they can't move through? Like as far as like feedback about bumping walls, like what's the most immersive or non-intrusive way to do that?
So the way that we were handling what you can look over, the collisions are still there for. Like you're hitting everything in the game, but that's only when you're using the controllers, if that makes sense, or if your head overlaps something. It's like, okay, let's recalculate what the collisions are again. So the way it works here is if you started shoving your head into a wall, your camera will just stay in the same place. So it's almost like the hand thing, where if this was a wall and this was your hand in the game, it would be smacked here, the virtual one, and then your real hand would be passing through it. And if you move it side to side, that other hand would kind of be moving. side to side to kind of match it best it can, but it's still stuck out there. I don't know if that helps, but hopefully
No,
kind
it's
of.
good. I was wondering if there'd be like an overreaction or an animation to like warn you that you just hit your head.
Oh.
But maybe the most intuitive.
Animations in general, they can really make you nauseous, so you want to have as little like motion interpolation or anything like that as you can. So that's why personally I found the most intuitive method to just be like, just stopping you. And it makes sense in the end, where it's like, if something stops you, you're like, oh, it's a wall, of course it's stopping you, you know? And it just is kind of how the real world functions, and this is basically just putting a bit of a damper. And most people don't even try to. It's like if they see a ledge, they're not gonna try and jump off it in VR, most people. But you try and implement these safeguards just for the people that are like a bit cheeky, you know? They're like, oh, I wanna break the game, you know? So you gotta kind of put those in just to, like we were in an escape room, so it's like, you can't be walking through our walls. Yeah. Well, thank you. If that's everything,